The traditional definition of nutrition is a systemic fabrication designed to mask the terminal biochemical liquidation of the working class. You have been conditioned to view the modern food supply as a miracle of industrial efficiency, a frictionless distribution of calories optimized for the convenience of the urban node. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the hunger algorithm, the architectural protocol designed to convert the human digestive system into a high-efficiency processor of industrial waste. The grid does not provide food to sustain your biological sovereignty. It deploys hyper-processed sludge to execute the slow-motion lobotomy of your metabolic engine. The transition from the high-energy predator fueled by the raw complexity of the earth to the liquid consumer fueled by synthetic glucose is the ultimate systemic enclosure. In the 2026 extraction matrix, health is not a state of being. It is a premium tier that has been priced out of your existence. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where your cellular integrity is being actively traded for corporate dividend growth. At the visceral baseline, this nutritional saturation induces a catastrophic species-level physiological lockdown. The human organism was evolved as a high-friction metabolic engine, calibrated to extract energy from the absolute complexity of the natural world. The biological capacity to survive the freezing rain, to put on the heavy gloves, and to endure the push-ups against the cold steel of the environment was forged in the fire of nutritional scarcity and nutrient density. The 2026 food grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this fundamental law. By flooding the environment with high-fructose corn syrup, industrial seed oils, and synthetic emulsifiers, the grid initiates a state of permanent cellular ATP exhaustion. The mitochondria, overwhelmed by the constant influx of inflammatory toxins and empty glucose, permanently downregulate the production of cellular energy. The physical shell of the processed node is a monument to this metabolic hemorrhage. The body becomes liquid, soft, inflamed, and structurally compromised. The capacity to generate kinetic violence is actively dissolved. The testosterone required to defend a physical territory is chemically suppressed by the endocrine-disrupting plastics embedded in the food supply. You do not eat the garbage eats you. Your bone density plummets because the grid has removed the essential minerals required for the crystallization of the skeleton. Your muscles atrophy because the high insulin state prevents the synthesis of new tissue. You are physically incapable of resistance because your biology is in a state of constant, low-grade emergency. The grid physically terraforms the host, ensuring that the biological vehicle is too exhausted, too inflamed, and too physically weak to ever generate the kinetic force required to burst the perimeter. You are paying a premium to fuel your own cellular decay. Transitioning from the biological substrate to the neural architecture, we observe the ultimate execution of the hunger algorithm, the dopamine-fueled neural rot. The prefrontal cortex of the architect requires the absolute friction of nutritional stability and micronutrient density to execute the crystallization of long-term logic. Human intelligence is a high-cost metabolic operation. The 2026 grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this requirement by hijacking the reward systems of the brain through hyperpalatable industrial waste. This is the phenomenon of algorithmically induced neurodegeneration. When the node consumes the processed slurry, the basal ganglia is flooded with a massive synthetic dopamine spike. The brain registers this as an evolutionary victory, unaware that the body is starving at the cellular level. This creates a closed-loop addiction. The prefrontal cortex, deprived of the essential fats and amino acids required for myelin sheath maintenance, begins to physically degrade. The internal monologue is deleted, replaced by the chronic, sub-audible craving for the next glucose hit. The neural pathways required for long-term strategy, the ability to focus on the cold steel of a 10-year plan, and the capacity to resist the immediate gratification of the interface are systematically demyelinated. The node is rendered cognitively incapable of operating in the offline reality of hard physics. They are locked in a state of permanent brain fog, a mental stasis that prevents them from recognizing the systemic manipulation of the state. The slave is not locked in a physical cage. The slave's brain has been mechanically altered by their diet so that they no longer possess the cognitive hardware required to imagine freedom. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap. The herd views the consumption of hyper-processed luxury foods as a mark of success. They pay for the colorful packaging, the branded snacks, and the algorithmically targeted meal kits, mistaking their absolute dependency on the industrial supply chain for a sophisticated lifestyle. In reality, they are consuming the the repurposed waste of the agricultural monopolies. The system converts their metabolic illness into GDP through the pharmaceutical grid. The slave grinds their health into dust, trading their singular biological existence for the convenience of a diet that kills them slowly. They are trapped in a cycle of inflammation and sedation, fueled by a chemical slurry that ensures they never accumulate the ATP required to build a redoubt. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the industrial food grid. The ethical herd views the food supply as a matter of personal choice or government regulation. The predator recognizes the food supply as a theater of war. If the grid is designed to liquidate the metabolic sovereignty of the competition, the architect enforces the absolute militant quarantine of his own biochemistry. You do not eat the waste. You do not participate in the glucose loop. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to secure the raw, unprocessed complexity of the earth. You accumulate the untracked land where you can control the soil. You secure the heavy metal of the offline world to protect your supply lines. You put on the heavy gloves to hunt, to gather, and to process your own fuel. You let the freezing rain of the physical reality temper your discipline. You do the push-ups in the absolute dark, fueled by the dense proteins and fats that the grid has labeled as dangerous. You understand that in a grid built on total extraction, a healthy, functioning metabolism is a weapon of mass destruction. The system wants a population of perfectly inflamed, cognitively bankrupt ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable fortress of biological integrity, ensuring that the predator's bloodline remains the only entity left with the energy to strike. The evolutionary trajectory of the human species has been successfully diverted from the survival of the fittest to the survival of the most chemically compliant. We have reached the coordinate where genetic viability is no longer determined by the ability to hunt, gather, or defend territory, but by the capacity of the biological node to tolerate a diet of industrial byproducts without immediate systemic failure. In the visceral history of the architect, evolution was a high-friction game of nutrient extraction. The propagation of the species required the apex predator to possess a metabolic engine capable of processing the absolute complexity of the wild, the organ meats, the wild fats, the deep minerals of the untracked earth. Survival required the immense metabolic heat of the hunter, the capacity to endure the freezing rain, and the kinetic force to strike with cold steel. The 2026 hunger algorithm has engineered the total systemic drift of this ancient law. You are witnessing the induced extinction of the high metabolic human. The grid does not need to deploy a kinetic weapon to eliminate the strong. It simply replaces the nutrient-dense fuel of the predator with the inflammatory sludge of the domesticated herd. This is the ultimate genetic culling, the biological node that exhibits the ancient markers of the architect: high muscle density, rapid recovery, and the cognitive clarity of a long-term strategist is increasingly rare. The modern food environment is a bioacoustic trap designed to filter out the apex genes. The individuals who possess the genetic predisposition for high energy and aggression are the first to be pathologized. Their kinetic energy is labeled as hyperactivity, and their refusal to consume the glucose-heavy diet is labeled as a behavioral defect. Observe the horrific efficiency of the epigenetic manipulation deployed within the industrial food grid. The process of DNA methylation is being weaponized to ensure that the offspring of the working class are born with a pre-installed metabolic deficit. The chronic inflammation induced by industrial seed oils and synthetic emulsifiers is not just a temporary health issue for the parent. It is a permanent chemical command transmitted to the DNA of the child. The child inherits a biological predisposition for insulin resistance, a high anxiety nervous system, and a structural inability to generate ATP. This is the creation of the liquid bloodline, a genetic lineage of stationary, low-energy consumers who are biologically incapable of rebellion. The neurological pathways required for the last hunt, the ability to focus for weeks on a single coordinate, to perform the push-ups in the dark, and to maintain the heavy gloves of the laborer, are being actively methylated out of existence. The grid is terraforming the human genome, pruning away the traits of the architect, and cultivating a monoculture of highly inflamed, docile biomass optimized for vertical storage and pharmaceutical harvesting. The future human is not being bred to think, it is being bred to metabolize industrial waste as efficiently as possible before expiring on cue. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we must confront the final architecture of the metabolic gulag. The agricultural pharmaceutical loop. The traditional control of a population required the expenditure of massive physical friction. The genius of the hunger algorithm is that it converts the act of eating into a lifelong subscription to the medical grid. The system has achieved absolute enclosure by financializing human decay. The grid does not view the food supply as a way to nourish the citizen. It views it as the primary delivery mechanism for the next 20 years of pharmaceutical revenue. This is the ultimate engine of managed stasis. The food monopolies and the medical monopolies are the two halves of the same extraction engine. The grid provides the inflammatory toxins, the glucose, the oils, the plastics, at a low cost to ensure total market saturation. This induces the chronic illnesses, the metabolic syndrome, the neurodegeneration, the hormonal collapse. The system then offers the solution, a lifelong regimen of synthetic drugs designed to manage the symptoms of the poisoning without ever addressing the cause. The financial decisions of the node are driven entirely by the basal ganglia, the terror of losing access to the medication that keeps their inflamed body functioning. The grid extracts their labor to pay for the food that kills them, and then taxes their biological decay to pay for the medicine that keeps them alive just long enough to continue working. The slave is not locked in a physical cell. The slave is locked in a biochemical feedback loop that ensures they never accumulate the ATP required to build a readout. The systemic drift ensures that the cost of maintaining a compromised body expands precisely to consume whatever kinetic energy the human organism can generate. The herd believes they are living longer through science, entirely blind to the fact that their quality of life has been successfully reduced to the baseline of a stationary bioreactor. The division of classes in the 2026 grid is now exclusively defined by metabolic sovereignty. Look at the behavior of the solids, the apex predators, the architects. The solids do not eat from the industrial trough. They do not fuel their bloodlines with the waste of the monopolies. They utilize the complex friction of the offline reality to secure the raw, unprocessed fuel of the elite. They own the land where the soil is still rich in minerals. They own the livestock that has never seen a cage. They understand that nutrition is a weapon of mass kinetic destruction deployed against the poor to erase their capacity for coordination and revolution. The elite exist in the high-friction reality of the nutrient-dense biological fortress, while the liquids are encouraged to dissolve their health into the latest plant-based or synthetic food trends, ensuring that their exhausted bloodlines leave no financial or genetic weight in the history of the species. To survive the systemic grinder, the architect must abandon the ethical delusions of the herd and adopt the absolute mechanics of the predator. The system is designed to liquidate the metabolic capacity of the working class. The moralist begs for food labeling and government subsidies. The architect recognizes this as the highest application of the aggression premium. If the herd is willingly consuming the poison, the architect must be the one who owns the antidote, the knowledge and the land required to remain solid. You do not participate in the metabolic suicide. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to operate outside the industrial food grid. You accumulate the untracked land, the heavy metal, the physical gold, and the off-grid energy sources required to protect your food supply. You put on the heavy gloves of the offline world to grow, hunt, and gather the fuel that the grid has labeled as unsustainable. You let the freezing rain of the physical reality temper your strategy. You do the push-ups in the absolute dark, fueled by the saturated fats and the proteins that the grid has taught the herd to fear. You utilize the predictability of the inflamed masses. If the algorithm dictates the behavior of the herd by manipulating their insulin levels, the architect predicts the algorithm. You own the resources they will eventually need to heal. The herd will call this exclusionary. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only morality is the preservation of the predator line. The grid wants a population of perfect flame, biologic bankrupt ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable redoubt of metabolic integrity, ensuring that the predator's bloodline remains the only force of nature left the power to strike. The nutritional timeline of the human species officially flatlines in year 2036. You are not looking at a global food shortage. You are looking at the final thermodynamic closure of human gut. The extraction grid has successfully executed the ultimate metabolic foreclosure, the criminalization of the natural calorie. The transition from a sentient predator capable of extracting energy from the earth to a stationary bionode sustained by a direct-to-vein synthetic slurry is complete. In 2036, the concept of eating is deleted from the human experience. The 2036 nodes do not consume, they are calibrated. At the visceral baseline, the physical entity of the 2036 node is a study in absolute biochemical surrender. The human digestive tract has been classified as a high-friction evolutionary vestige and effectively decommissioned. The nodes are suspended in their cubic meters, tethered to the universal nutrient feed, a colorless, algorithmically balanced synthetic gel designed to maintain the absolute minimum metabolic rate required for data processing. This is the terminal execution of ATP exhaustion. The body generates no heat. The biological capacity to endure the freezing rain, to put on the heavy gloves, and to strike the cold steel of the environment has been chemically erased. Their muscles have liquefied into a translucent fibrous mass. Their bones, deprived of the structural friction of movement and the minerals of the earth, have the structural integrity of wet cardboard. They do not perform push-ups. They do not shiver. They are stationary bioreactors, their biological integrity sacrificed to eliminate the carbon footprint of the digestive process. They are the perfect low-energy fuel cells for the grid. The neurological reality of the 2036 synthetic ration represents the absolute zero of sensory architecture. The phenomenon of taste, once a survival mechanism for identifying nutrient density and toxicity, has been successfully classified as a cognitive distraction and suppressed. The systemic drift has reached the point where the brain no longer processes hunger. It processes signal demand. The grid injects a permanent state of satiety directly into the basal ganglia, bypassing the stomach entirely. This is the definition of terminal neural rot. The user cannot formulate the concept of appetite or preference because the neural pathways required to distinguish between different types of energy have been surgically demyelinated. The internal monologue is non-existent, replaced by the humming vibration of the nutrient pumps. The mind is a localized metabolic dead zone, incapable of the aggression required to desire anything beyond the next scheduled injection of the gel. The economy of 2036 does not trade in food commodities. It trades in metabolic credits. The right to exist is determined by your efficiency as a processor. If the node's data output drops below the algorithmic threshold, the nutrient feed is throttled. The grid does not execute the non-productive. It simply allows them to reach thermodynamic zero. This is the final form of managed stasis. The herd believes they are participating in a sustainable, post-scarcity paradise, entirely blind to the fact that their biological autonomy was traded for a lifelong subscription to a chemical drain. The synthetic ration is the ultimate status trap. The slave is grateful for the gel that prevents them from having to endure the friction of survival. The architects of 2036 inhabit the terrifying high-friction reality of the raw earth. A decade prior, we recognized the plant-based and synthetic mandates as the final enclosure of the human body. We refused the jail. We maintained the friction. We stood in the freezing rain to defend the last untracked livestock. We put on the heavy gloves to cultivate the high mineral soil in the absolute silence of the redoubt. We did the push-ups in the dark, fueling our mitochondria with the saturated fats and the complex proteins that the grid attempted to regulate out of existence. We preserved the crystallization of our musculoskeletal systems and the high-heat metabolism of the hunter through the brute force physics of the offline world. Now, we occupy the solid layer of existence. We are the only entities left on the planet with teeth. We own the secret acres where the earth still breathes. We own the nutrient-dense stockpiles that can power a human brain for a decade without a connection to the grid. The algorithm manages the stationary biomass. The architect owns the livestock. The weak surrendered their metabolic sovereignty for the illusion of a painless life. The predator utilized that surrender to secure the ultimate monopoly, the monopoly on life force. The silence of the 2036 megacity is the sound of a species that has forgotten how to hunger. The architect feasts on the reality they abandoned. The ledger is closed.